Erik the Spearman, the strongest hunter in Steinvik, did not know it. But when the dawn sun failed to break the fjord's icy mist, his fate was sealed. Because Signy the Gothi, the High Priestess, had finally laid her eyes upon him, and she watched him not as a woman watches a man, but with a primal, forbidden hunger that blurred the line between the sacred and the profane, a hunger that no prayer could ever hope to tame. The village was dying. The Fimbulwinter had now raged for 6 lightless months. The cattle were long gone, their bones picked clean, and the wails of starving children had replaced the sounds of life in the longhouse. Jarl Hrolf, an old man with a grey-streaked beard, had tried everything. He had bled horses to Odin, prayed to Freyr for sun, cast the runes until his hands were raw. Nothing. The gods remained silent, but Signy thrived in the despair. She had come from the north years ago, a tall, pale figure with eyes so clear they seemed to see through flesh and into the marrow of a man's soul. She lived alone in the temple on the hill, and as the village's desperation grew, so did her power. She commanded the rituals now, her low hypnotic voice echoing over the snow, demanding more devotion, more blood, and it was during the last full moon sacrifice that she truly saw Erik. He was the image of Viking vitality in a village of walking corpses. Tall, broad-shouldered, with arms thick from the oar and the spear. He was life. He was strength. He was everything the village was losing. Signy watched him haul a frozen deer carcass onto the stone altar. She saw the sweat on his brow despite the crushing cold. She saw the muscles of his back and chest strain against his tunic, and in that instant, her hunger shifted. It was no longer the spiritual plea of a priestess. It became something older, darker, a carnal, ravenous need. She saw in Erik not a savior, but the offering itself. That night she claimed Odin finally spoke to her in a fever dream. He was finished with the blood of beasts. He demanded the best the village had to offer. He demanded the strength of the strongest warrior. He demanded the flesh. "The All-Father demands a final sacrifice, my Jarl," she said the next morning, her voice a cold, silken threat. "A sacrifice of warrior's flesh, so that the flesh of your people may be spared. He demands Erik the Spearman." Jarl Hrolf felt the blood drain from his face. "Sacrifice our best man? That is madness, Signy. It's suicide." "And that is why the gods demand him," she hissed, stepping closer. "Odin does not accept weak offerings. Give him the feast he demands, or this entire village will be a tomb before the ice melts." Hrolf looked at the desperate, hollowed-out faces of the village elders. He saw the terror in their eyes. He was trapped between starvation and the dark, intoxicating power of his priestess. And so Erik's fate was sealed, not by an enemy's axe, but by the twisted desire of a holy woman and the desperation of a starving people. And if this story of forbidden hunger and cruel destiny is already gripping your soul, hit that like button and subscribe, because what comes next is the descent into the heart of a ritual so dark it was meant to be forgotten. They seized Erik at midnight. He was dragged from his sleep, not by warriors in armor, but by the Jarl's own house guard, men he had known his whole life, who now refused to meet his eyes. He didn't fight. To fight the Jarl's order was to declare himself an outcast, and in this frozen world, an outcast was a dead man. But as they pushed him up the snowy path toward the temple on the hill, he felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the wind. The temple was suffocating. The air, thick with smoke and the smell of burning herbs, was almost unbreathable. And she was waiting. Signy stood before the altar, bathed in the glow of a single, flickering fire pit. She was no longer the pale priestess in simple robes. She was draped in black wolf furs, her long dark hair unbound, and her face painted with symbols of blood and ash. But it was her eyes. Her eyes were alive, burning with a terrifying, ecstatic light. "The gods are hungry, Erik the Spearman," she whispered, her voice seeming to come from the shadows themselves. and you are the feast." The guards forced him to his knees before the stone altar. She ordered them to leave. He was alone with her. She began to circle him, slow and deliberate, like a predator. Her ritual chant was low, a vibration he felt in his chest more than he heard. She wasn't praying for the village, she was consecrating him. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could smell her, not the acrid smoke of the temple, but a faint, intoxicating scent of jasmine and sweat. "You are strong," she murmured, her voice dropping the ritual tone, becoming something deeply personal. She reached out, not with a ceremonial knife, but with her hand. Her fingers, icy cold, traced the outline of the muscles in his neck, his shoulders, his chest. Erik trembled, but not from the cold. This was not the sacred ritual he expected. This was something else. This was a violation. "Signy, Gothi, this is not right," he managed to say, his voice thick. She laughed, a low, throaty sound that held no humor, only power. "Right, the gods are starving, little spearman, and I am their vessel. I decide what is right." Her touch became possessor. Her hands moved over his bound arms, his chest. She was not preparing a sacrifice for Odin. She was claiming her own. He felt a wave of cold, profound shame. This was not the honorable death in battle he had always dreamed of. This was a defilement. "They will eat, and so will I," she whispered, leaning in so close her hair brushed his face. And in that smoky, suffocating temple, under the unblinking eyes of the stone gods, Signy began her ritual feast. She forced his head back, her power absolute. He was the strongest warrior in the village, yet in that moment he was utterly powerless, his strength meaningless against the combined force of religious fervor and a desperate, forbidden hunger. He had been brought here as a sacrifice to the gods, but he was consumed by her first. The line between divine ritual and human darkness is terrifyingly thin. And what happened next would push the entire village over that edge, into a nightmare from which they would never wake. Tavis. Dawn broke, grey and weak. The villagers, huddled against the cold, had been gathered at the foot of the temple hill since first light. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and terrified. The Jarl's guards stood grim-faced, barring anyone from leaving. Then Signy appeared at the temple door. She was transformed. Her dark hair was matted with sweat and something else. Her eyes, once clear, were now cloudy and dilated, still lost in the ecstasy of the night's ritual. She raised her arms and her voice boomed over the silent crowd. "Odin has accepted the offering. The long night is over." A few weak cheers rose from the crowd, but they died instantly as they saw what she held. In her hands was not a holy relic, but a long, rune-carved skinning knife, its edge dripping with fresh, dark blood. "The All-Father has supped," she cried, a terrifying smile twisting her lips. "And now, we feast in his honor." She turned and motioned to the guards. They entered the temple and returned a moment later, carrying the butchered, pale remains of what was once Erik the Spearman. A collective gasp of horror rippled through the crowd. This was not a sacrifice. This was a desecration. Jarl Hrolf, his face the color of ash, stepped forward. "Signy, this is Nid, a dishonor. This is madness. This is not the way." Signy rounded on him, her eyes blazing with absolute power. "Not the way?" she shrieked. "Your way gave us nothing. Your way left our children to die. I offered myself to the god. I communicated with him, and this is his command." She pointed the bloody knife at the starving villagers. "Odin has provided this feast. This is not the flesh of a man. It is the blessed flesh of a god's chosen. To eat is to accept his gift. To refuse—" She leaned in, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, "is to spit in his eye. To refuse is to join Erik in death." The villagers stared, trapped. The smell of raw, butchered meat hung in the frozen air. It was horrific. It was profane. And to their starving bodies, It smelled like food. A woman at the front, whose child had died just 2 nights before, let out a low animalistic moan. She saw not the warrior she had known. She saw only protein. She saw survival. Signy watched this internal battle. She saw the primal, desperate hunger in their eyes begin to conquer the civilized taboo she knew she had won. The final barrier of humanity was about in break. The priestess had given the order, the starving had their justification, and the true, dark ritual was about to begin. There was a terrible silence on the snow. The only sound was the wind and the heavy, ragged breathing of the crowd. It was the woman who had lost her child who moved. First, her eyes were dead. She stumbled forward, fell to her knees, and did what was unthinkable an hour before. She grabbed a piece of the raw offering. That single, desperate act broke the dam of sanity one by one. Then in a sudden, horrific rush, the starving villagers surged forward. They were no longer men and women. They were a pack. All pretense of ritual was gone. There was only the sound of tearing, of grunting, of a desperate, animalistic feeding. Jarl Hrolf turned away, vomiting into the snow. The guards, loyal to Signy, stood like stone statues, their faces pale masks of horror, and Signy stood above them all on the temple steps, her arms outstretched, her face turned to the grey sky, laughing. She was no longer a priestess. She was a goddess of hunger, bathed in the glory of her obscene victory. The ritual was, in its own terrible way, a success. She had convinced them. She had used their faith and their desperation to shatter the greatest taboo of their people. What happened to the village of Steinvik? The sagas do not speak of it by name, but they tell dark, whispered stories of Draugr, the undead, and of entire villages that vanished, consumed by a hunger from within. Archaeological digs in remote fjords have unearthed settlements where the bones of the inhabitants show the unmistakable, terrifying marks of having been butchered, not by enemies, but by each other. The winter, as it always does, eventually ended. But the survivors of Steinvik were no longer human. They had feasted on the flesh of their strongest warrior, and in doing so had consumed their own souls. They were spoken of only in hushed tones as a place cursed by the gods, a testament to a darkness that, once invited in, never truly leaves. Signy's twisted ritual, born from a profane hunger and a lust for power, had worked, but the cost was the very humanity she claimed to be saving. The darkest stories are the ones hidden in the shadows of our own history, the ones that prove that the greatest monsters are not supernatural, but human. If this descent into the lost, dark sagas of the North has held you in its grip, subscribe to Nordic Lawkeeper. We unearth the forbidden tales and forgotten horrors that history tried to bury, and let us know in the comments. Do you believe Signy was a fanatic who truly heard the gods, or a predator who saw her chance?